The dinghy is in federal hands. The 8-foot hard-hull vessel Brian Hooker says his wife bounced off of on April 4th is no longer in the Bahamas. On Thursday, June 4th, 2026, United States Coast Guard investigators seized the boat at the center of every word Brian Hooker has spoken about the night Lynette Hooker vanished. 61 days, one vessel, and what investigators are now hunting for on its hull tells you exactly what they believe happened on it. Because the search for Lynette Hooker's remains in the Abacos came up empty, but what came off that dinghy may be the heavier story. If you want every verified development in the Lynette Hooker case as it lands, subscribe now, because this investigation is still moving. Lynette Hooker, 55 years old, disappeared on the evening of April 4th in the Abacos in the Bahamas. Her husband, Brian Hooker, told authorities they were riding their 8-foot hard-hull dinghy back to Soulmate, their 46-foot Morgan sailboat anchored in Aunt Pat's Bay off Elbow Key. He says rough seas at roughly 7:30 p.m. caused Lynette to bounce off the back of the dinghy. He says she took the kill switch lanyard with her, the engine died, and he drifted roughly 9 hours before reaching shore near Marsh Harbor around 4:15 a.m. He was detained for 5 days. He was released without charges. He has repeatedly denied any wrongdoing, and his Bahamian attorney, Terrell Butler, has stated that authorities have not presented evidence his client committed wrongdoing. That is the official posture. Now here is what shifted on Thursday, June 4th. The case is being investigated as a possible homicide. Coast Guard divers have entered the Sea of Abaco. Cadaver dog Maggie, on loan from the Broward County Sheriff's Office with her handler Chris, has worked the shoreline, and the Royal Bahamas Police Force has turned over the dinghy that has sat in their warehouse custody for nearly 8 weeks. But the search for Lynette Hooker's remains over 3 full days, sonar, drones, divers, dog, produced nothing, and that absence is its own piece of evidence. The mainstream timeline of this case has always centered on what Brian Hooker said happened. What investigators are now building is the opposite, a record of what should be there and isn't. Start with the GPS data. A federal official has stated that location data extracted from Brian Hooker's devices conflicts with his account of where Lynette went into the water. Both Hookers were experienced live-aboard sailors. People who have spent years on Soulmate do not misremember where they were at 7:30 p.m. on the evening their spouse disappeared. And yet the position Brian Hooker described and the position his own device recorded are not the same position. Why does that matter? Because in a no-body homicide investigation, provable lies do work that physical evidence usually does. Then there is the engine. The dinghy, currently in Coast Guard custody, is fitted with an NT-300 outboard. But the original engine, the Torpedo electric outboard that lived on that dinghy for years, is missing. Not on Soulmate. Not in the dinghy. Not accounted for. Live-aboard cruisers do not throw away backup propulsion. A dinghy is a lifeline. A spare engine is the spare lifeline. So where is the Torpedo? Was it used to weigh something down? That question has not been answered. Verification remains pending. There is also the thermal imaging camera. Unverified reports from a friend of the Hookers indicate Soulmate was equipped with a thermal camera valued at approximately $33,000. On the night of April 4th, by Brian Hooker's own account, he was alone in open water searching for his wife in failing light. The camera, per those same unverified reports, was not used, and the AIS, Soulmate's automatic identification system, was reportedly switched off from roughly 9:30 p.m. on April 4th until Hopetown Fire and Rescue boarded the vessel the next morning. A live-aboard sailor turning off the system that broadcasts their position during the exact window their wife is allegedly drifting at sea is a fact that does not interpret itself. Lynette Hooker was a strong swimmer. Her daughter, Carly Ellsworth, has stated publicly that Lynette never carried the dinghy key. That responsibility was Brian's. Carly has also described the marriage as volatile, with prior allegations of domestic incidents that Brian Hooker has denied. None of this is a charge. None of this is a conviction. but the pattern. For 3 days, the Coast Guard cutter held position off Elbow Key. Sonar swept the channel. Divers worked the anchorage where Soulmate was tied off in Aunt Pat's Bay. Maggie searched the mangroves north of a large white residence on the western shore, the exact stretch where Brian Hooker's GPS placed him late on the night of April 4th and 5th. The dinghy was lifted, dried, and brought into a climate-controlled garage so Maggie could work it cleanly. Maggie did not alert, not on the dinghy, not on the shoreline, not in the water. The cutter was scheduled to leave the Abacos at 10:30 a.m. on Friday, June 5th, and Lynette Hooker was not coming home with it. That looked, for one full afternoon, like the end of the search. It wasn't. Because what investigators did not find in the places they should have found things turned out to be as damning as anything they could have recovered. Does a missing torpedo engine on a live-aboard cruiser's dinghy point toward an accident, or does it point toward something used to weigh evidence down? If the forensic results from that dinghy come back this month, you'll want to be here for it. Here is how a no-body homicide is built. You do not need a body to prosecute. Former federal prosecutors who specialize in no-body cases have stated publicly that once these cases reach trial, conviction rates are exceptionally high. The challenge is reaching trial, and the way you reach trial is by stacking provable lies against verifiable physical absences until the only remaining explanation is the one the defendant refuses to offer. The dinghy is the first stack. The Coast Guard Investigative Service did not seize that 8-foot vessel casually. Cadaver dog Maggie was placed inside the boat before it was moved. A CGIS agent was observed on board examining a life jacket. One of the 2 life jackets Brian Hooker himself acknowledged were stowed under the seats and not worn. The dinghy was loaded onto a tender, brought to the cutter, and is now en route to United States forensic facilities for examination focused on 3 categories: blood, hair, and indentations consistent with a struggle. Micro Reveal 1. Blood. Even cleaned blood does not vanish. Luminol and modern hemoglobin detection can identify residue invisible to the naked eye, weeks or months after the fact. If anything happened on the interior of that dinghy on April 4th, the lab will see it. Micro Reveal 2. Hair. A single recovered strand with a follicle attached produces DNA. And on Thursday, Carly Ellsworth and Lynette Hooker's parents, Darlene and Dan, provided mouth swab DNA samples to investigators. 3 reference profiles are already on file. If any biological trace on that dinghy belongs to Lynette Hooker, identification is not a question of weeks. It is a question of laboratory hours. Micro Reveal 3. Indentations. A gouge, a compression mark, a stress fracture in the hard hull can be measured against known objects to determine cause. The shape of an impact tells investigators whether it is consistent with a person falling backward into open water, or whether it is consistent with something else. And then the kill switch. Brian Hooker says Lynette grabbed the lanyard as she went over, cutting the engine. A deliberately disconnected lanyard reads differently under examination than a lanyard yanked by a falling body. The mechanism preserves its own history. The second stack is what investigators did not find in the water. Brian Hooker says Lynette went overboard with the dry bag containing the spare engine key. He says he lost one of his oars during the drift. In the Abacos, shallow, clear, current-patterned, debris of that type tends to surface. Local searchers, including residents working the shoreline independently, have not recovered the dry bag. They have not recovered the oar. They have not recovered the kill switch float that should accompany the lanyard. What is not where it should be is part of the case being assembled. And then there is the witness account from the night of April 4th. Unverified reports indicate that around 9:30 p.m., a witness near the anchorage reported a significant splash, described as large, not incidental, in the vicinity of Soulmate. Multiple individuals in that group reportedly observed flares in the sky or across the water in the same general area. Brian Hooker's account places him roughly a mile north of Lubber's quarters at the time he says he fired flares. The witness account places flares near Soulmate. Those are 2 different geographies. Verification remains pending on the witness statements. But the question that closes this section is the one investigators are now answering with sonar logs, GPS extractions, and a dinghy heading to a forensic lab. For 7.5 weeks, the dinghy sat in a warehouse in the Bahamas, out of the rain, out of the sun, sealed away from every form of interference. Brian Hooker was in Michigan. The vessel was in a locked garage on Elbow Key. He could not approach it. He could not clean it. He could not adjust the kill switch, retrieve a single fiber, or reposition a single life jacket. That dinghy was preserved exactly as it existed at 4:15 a.m. on April 5th, the moment Brian Hooker stepped off it and into the rest of his life. And on Thursday, June 4th, sources described the evidence the Royal Bahamas Police Force handed to Coast Guard investigators, beyond the dinghy itself, as, quote, potentially devastating for Brian Hooker. Sources also confirmed the trip was, in their words, well worth it. What was handed over alongside the dinghy has not been publicly disclosed, so consider what is now in motion simultaneously. Soulmate, the 46-foot Morgan sailboat, was seized last month and moved to Fort Lauderdale. Its electronics, its surfaces, its hold spaces are inside a U.S. forensic chain of custody. The dinghy is now joining it. CGIS agents have been processing materials at Quantico. The GPS data from Brian Hooker's devices is reportedly already driving where divers enter the water and where cadaver dogs work the mangroves. This is not a search operation anymore. This is evidence assembly for a courtroom. Brian Hooker has not been charged with any crime. He maintains his innocence. His attorney has stated that no evidence of wrongdoing has been presented. Those facts remain true, and they will remain true until a charging instrument is filed, which, in a no-body homicide matter, typically follows the completion of forensic processing on the primary scene evidence. The dinghy is now that primary scene evidence. There are still verification gaps. The contents of the Torpedo engine question remain open. The witness statements about the splash and flares near Soulmate remain unverified. The specific items the Bahamian police handed over alongside the dinghy have not been publicly identified. Whether the AIS shutdown window is corroborated by independent data logs remains pending. None of these gaps should be filled by speculation. The procedural pattern here, physical evidence-led no-body prosecution built from a sequenced digital then physical investigation, is not new. The Brian Walsh case in Cohasset, Massachusetts, advanced toward indictment on circumstantial and digital evidence in the absence of Anna Walsh's remains, with forensic processing of vehicles and residents playing the same anchoring role the dinghy is now playing here. The Lewis Bennett case, prosecuted federally in the Southern District of Florida after the disappearance of Isabella Hellman at sea, was built largely on contradictions between the surviving spouse's account and the physical condition of the vessel. Both cases reached charging decisions without remains. Both cases relied on what the boat said when the defendant could no longer change it. Lynette Hooker has been missing for 61 days. Her daughter, Carly Ellsworth, gave a DNA sample on Thursday. Her parents, Darlene and Dan, did the same. The Coast Guard cutter departs Friday, June 5th. The dinghy is on its way to the United States. And the question Brian Hooker now lives inside is no longer whether investigators believe him. It is whether the 8-foot vessel he claims his wife bounced off of will tell the same story he has. If this case matters to you, the next development out of Quantico is one you won't want to miss. Whether the missing Torpedo engine from Soulmate's dinghy is ever recovered, and what the Royal Bahamas Police Force handed to Coast Guard investigators alongside the vessel itself on June 4th, are the two questions the public record has not yet answered.